needed a little pick-me-up myself, so that really is going to get us started. Good evening. I'm Alice Gonzalez-Yates, CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. Since 1997, when I was a student actually, with the opening of the Presidential Library and Museum in the Bush School of Government and Public Service, President George H.W. Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush became part of the fabric of this community. They invited their dear friends who happened to be world leaders and their family, who were also extraordinary leaders, into the classrooms, into these auditoriums, and into our lives to inspire and impact the next generation. It's our privilege at the George and Barbara Bush Foundation to continue that tradition tonight. Our special thanks to the members of the Bush family who are here with us. The Honorable George P. Bush, grandson of President Bush and son of Governor Jeb Bush. Our thanks also to Hap Ellis, nephew of President Bush and chairman of our board at the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. Thank you all for being here tonight. Tonight, our audience is full of distinguished guests, so I'm going to stray from the normal protocol of introducing all of them to you and let you know that in general in this room are former ambassadors, former senior staff members from President Bush's administration, members of our board of directors, our board of trustees, and distinguished guests from across the Texas A&M campus. And I'd like to acknowledge all of you and honor you for taking the time to be here tonight. But I would be remiss if I did not point out the reason why we are here tonight. President Bush, if you ever heard him talk about this little school, he said he loved this little school, and he was talking affectionately about the Bush School. But he always put students first on this campus. I'm told you could find him at the rec center, hanging out with the baseball team upon occasion, or the Corps Cadets. Students were the most important reason that he wanted his presidential library and museum to be here on the campus of Texas A&M University. And tonight, I know we have students from the Mays Business School, from the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and a special cohort from the College of Education, the Haynes Teaching Cohort, with us tonight. And to all of the rest of you from many different corners of campus, we are honored by your presence. Now, for tonight's program, what a privilege to introduce our distinguished guest. Guiding the discussion is the 43rd Governor of Florida and beloved son of President and Mrs. Bush, Governor Jeb Bush. Now, full disclosure, I introduced his brother a couple of months ago, and I also called him the beloved son. So I keep things very equal. They are all beloved children of President and Mrs. Bush. Governor Bush is a leader in both the public and private sectors. He served as a former adjunct professor here at the Bush School. He's the current chairman and founding partner of Finback Investment Partners and chairman of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation Board of Trustees. Governor Bush embodies the values of his father and deep commitment to public service. And it's also my privilege to introduce our very special guest, who I've had the privilege of spending time with this afternoon at the Presidential Library and Museum and the new pavilion. And it's been extraordinary to hear some of his stories of his time. He was a dear friend of President Bush. David M. Rubenstein. He's actually a leader who's done everything. He's an investor, a philanthropist, an interviewer, an author, and a historian. David is co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful private investment firms, and chairman and principal owner of Major League Baseball's Baltimore Orioles. Beyond business, David is celebrated for his patriotic philanthropy, restoring American landmarks and loaning historic documents to our nation to the U.S. government. He's an original signer of the Giving Pledge, a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the author of his latest book, The Highest Calling: Conversations on the American Presidency. Please join me in warmly welcoming Governor Jeb Bush and David Rubenstein to the stage for tonight's program.
Welcome to Aggieland.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it would be my pleasure to have interviewed you tonight.
That's not going to happen.
I was hoping to be able to interview you about your 2 terms as President of the United States. You would have finished your 2 terms by now, and you'd be building your own library here somewhere, right?
There's probably not room in Texas for that. I don't know. But talked to your children, and I said that the last time I saw you, you quickly said, I'm going to interview you in College Station. I said, no, I'm interviewing you, which is a little intimidating since you're probably the best interviewer on the planet right now. But I'm going to do my best. And they said, just fight hard through it, because he'll eventually accept the fact that you're the interviewee, not the interviewer. So
Okay.
it is a delight to be here. We're going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I want to talk about a few things about you, because you're just an extraordinary American in so many ways. You write in the preface that, does the world really need another book on the U.S. presidency? And there's probably a debate about that, but what motivated you to write I listened to the book. I'm an audiobook man, and it was fantastic because I got to hear the interviews from the historians and your conversations with them. It was a spectacular book. But what motivated you to write this, your fourth book?
When I was a little boy, I growing up in Baltimore, blue-collar family, I didn't have the charm, the good looks, the money, whatever it would take to be a candidate. I knew that early on. But I thought that I really admired the presidents and so forth. And John Kennedy was driving past my neighborhood one point, and I was like 10 or 11 years old, and I went out to see him, and I just saw this handsome guy, and I waved, and of course he waved back at me. And I just got mesmerized by the presidency. And when John Kennedy gave his inaugural address, I was in the 6th grade. My teacher went over it with me, and I just had the view that I really liked the presidency. I wanted to work in the White House. That was my goal, not to be a candidate ever, because I didn't think I had all the things that it would require to do that, but I wanted to be an advisor. My role model was Ted Sorensen, who had been the great speechwriter that really wrote a lot of the great things that President Kennedy did. And so I just had a fascination with it, and I tried over the years to get to know presidents, and I've been involved with knowing some of them, and I obviously knew your father very well, because your father, after he retired as the presidency, eventually I recruited Jim Baker to join my firm, and then he said, what about my friend George Herbert Walker Bush? He could help in some speeches or other things, and so he became an advisor to us. And I would say, of all the presidents I've met, not only the nicest man I ever met as president, but also the nicest person I ever met. Just an incredible person. And I spent the world a lot of years with him and your mother, traveling around the Far East, the Middle East, and so forth. And it was one of the most enjoyable parts of my life. And I think he liked me because he realized I was responsible for his becoming president. And let me see, I worked in the Carter White House, and I managed to get inflation to 19%, which no one has done since then. And as a result, Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush were elected in 1980. And as a result of becoming vice president, he then was in a position to run for president. Had he not become vice president, and had I not got inflation of 19%, he might not have become president. So I think he always bonded with me because he knew I really secretly got him elected president.
Okay. You've answered 4 of my questions already with that. So why the book? Why the presidents in the book, and why didn't some of the others make the cut?
Well, it wasn't supposed to be a definitive history of the presidency. As people who write books know, you kind of and do interviews. You do the interviews of the people you can get, and I interviewed some presidents and former presidents. I interviewed Joe Biden in the Oval Office. I interviewed now current President Donald Trump. He was out of office at the time, and other ones I could do. And then these are people that I knew the authors and so forth. And I just there's some presidents that they're not that significant, and I thought having an article on a certain insignificant president probably wouldn't be as appealing to the publisher or to the public. So it wasn't all that scientific. But
we're pretty happy that you did not do Franklin Pierce, who is also a relative of the Bush family on my mother's side, because he was one of the worst presidents in the country.
Franklin Pierce was not the greatest president of all time, but I know your mother was related to him. But you know how he got to be elected president? He had somebody write a booklet about him and why he deserved to be president. In those days, you didn't campaign. You didn't campaign. It was considered unseemly. Yeah. So Franklin Pierce had a young man write a book for him, and it was a really gifted book about why he was so great. His name was Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Oh, wow.
So how would you like to have Nathaniel Hawthorne write a book about why you should be president? It obviously worked, and he got elected.
Isn't it true that on the train going down for his inauguration, there was a horrible accident and his son died?
That I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it created, is that right, Andy? It created, his wife was so distraught. It was a miserable 4 years because of the loss of their son. I think Franklin may have taken a drink too many too.
Well, the most famous trip to Washington was Abraham Lincoln's. And just for those who haven't followed,
This is in the book. This is fantastic.
Abraham Lincoln couldn't take a train direct. In those days, the swearing in, the inauguration, was in March, not in January. So you're elected in November, you've got like 6 months before you actually take over. So Lincoln is sitting in Springfield trying to figure out what to do with himself and preparing for the inauguration and so forth. But to get to Washington, you could take a train directly through the Southern territories to get to Washington. But if he did so, he was afraid he'd be assassinated because there were people who were thinking that he was going to end slavery, and so therefore people in the South wanted to assassinate him. So he took a circuitous 66-day trip through various northern states and everywhere to just kind of meet people. No one really knew him. And then eventually he wound up in Washington about a week before the inauguration. But he had to, in Baltimore, there was the assassination was really supposed to take place in Baltimore, and he did some things to maneuver around the assassins. And that was a very tricky way to get to Washington, D.C., but it took him a long time to get there, and he had to come in under disguise when he got to Washington.
So the beginning of our country, the presidency was not really the highest calling in many ways. In the book, you mentioned Thomas Jefferson did not rank it as one of his top 3 accomplishments,
Right.
which is pretty striking. Now we think of the presidency almost as an imperial thing, that it's, it's got a majesty to it when it's done right, and it's larger than life. When did that kind of evolve to the point where the presidency has a totally different view than what Tommy Jefferson is?
Let me answer that. I mean, for the Jefferson part first, Jefferson on his epitaph didn't say President of the United States. He said, I want to have author of Declaration of Independence, although he once didn't want people to know it, and then founder of the University of Virginia. But interestingly, Jefferson, when those days the Constitution was different, and you could have people, a president and the vice president weren't in the same party. The Constitution hadn't been changed yet. So Jefferson was vice president under Adams. And then after that occurred, Jefferson ran against Adams for president, and he won. And Adams was so upset that he got out of town before Jefferson was inaugurated. Can you imagine a president not showing up at another president's inauguration? It's hard to believe. But he didn't show up. He got out of town at 4:30 in the morning. Jefferson walked by himself. No guards, no horses, nothing. Walks by himself to the inauguration. To answer your question, when Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to help end World War I, he was treated in Paris like Caesar had been treated when he came back from a victory and when he's going back to Rome. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people are cheering him because they think this is the man that's going to help end World War I. And Wilson actually was the first president of the United States to spend time outside of the United States while he was president. He spent off and on 6 months in Paris. And I think at that point it dawned on people that the president of the United States was the most important person in the world. And then obviously as World War II came along and then the Cold War and so forth, clearly the president of the United States was the most important person in the world, and the United States is the highest, the presidency is the highest calling. But I have to say, why do some people want this job? John Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson driven out of office. Richard Nixon driven out of office. Gerald Ford couldn't get reelected. My boss couldn't get reelected. Ronald Reagan almost was assassinated, and so forth. So you say, why do people want this job? Because in the end, people want to give back to the country, and they think it's the highest calling, and really it is the most important job in the world. There's no doubt about it.
So you had a great story in the book about your first day as a young aide to President Carter. You show up in the White House. Tell that story, because it's...
the outgoing chief of staff for Gerald Ford was a young man, 34 years old. His name was Richard Cheney, Dick Cheney. And I thought, 34 years old, his career's over, he's never going to hear from him again, right? But when we got in there, I was involved in the White House transition. He said, look, let me give you some advice. We're not coming into office on January 20th. So nobody's going to be here between 9 a.m. and 12 a.m., 12 when the president's inaugurated, and we're not going to be here that day. And then you got to have your people not hang around up on Capitol Hill and go to the parade. Have somebody here at 12 o'clock, because if there's an emergency, somebody's got to speak for the new president. And often presidents are spending time up on Capitol Hill for 2 hours or watching the parade. And so I went back and reported this to all the senior people in the Carter campaign. They said, well, we're going to the inauguration. You go in the White House. So, well, I was the most junior guy they could find. So there I am on Blair House right across the street. And at around noon, Carter's being inaugurated. I walked in the gates and say, okay, I'm David Rubenstein from the Carter administration. They say, well, you didn't get cleared in. Who are you? And I didn't know about getting cleared in really, and so it took me an hour to talk my way into the White House. So it was inauspicious. There were no crises, fortunately. And then I was the last person to leave. When we lost to Ronald Reagan, I was the last person out, and I knew it was over because the Ronald Reagan people came in and they redecorated the White House very quickly. They had Ronald Reagan photos, George Bush photos, and all the kind of things that would make it look like it was more of a Reagan house than a Carter house. So I've been there ever since then. I've gone back and forth and known presidents, but to me, it's whenever you go to the Oval Office, and you've been there many times, it's awe-inspiring, and it's the most famous office in the world, and it's amazing how many people say, I'm going to tell the president this, and then when they get in the Oval Office, say, oh, Mr. President, you're doing a great job. Oh, Mr. President, oh, please, can I have a picture? Can I have an autograph? So it's amazing how that office can intimidate people. I'm sure you've seen it.
I have. So you were there at the beginning. Isn't it true, like, there's this massive change of everything, the furniture, the carpet in the Oval, everything happens all at once, the residence gets changed, and you're the only guy in the Carter team that's watching this stuff happen?
Well, I was the only one. What happens is, as soon as the president is sworn in, the furnituring from the new president comes in, and then it's all redecorated. And so the president typically doesn't go to the Oval Office until maybe the next day. Sometimes they do, but generally what you do is it takes 2 hours to get sworn in or so. You have a lunch up on Capitol Hill, then the parade takes about 2 hours, and you go to the residence to get the change for the parade, and then you're watching the parade for 3 or 4 hours, and then you've got balls at night and so forth to go to. So the president don't usually get into the next day, and by that time, everything's been redecorated. Now, the new president, the current president, has redecorated more than I've seen any time in history. He's completely changed it, and it's just unusual, I'll put it that way. But the Oval Office was really invented by, you could argue, by Franklin Roosevelt. What happened was all the offices, the President of the United States used to meet just in the executive mansion, as it was called. And if you wanted to see a president in the early days, you just walked into the White House and you said, I want to see the president, and very often you could. I mean, there was no security, there was no gates, it was unbelievable. And for example, the man who shot Garfield walked in, wanted to see the president, said he was owed a job as ambassador to France. He got in to see the president. He didn't get the job, and that's why he assassinated Garfield. But it was different. And even when Lincoln was president and there were civil wars going on, they didn't have gates around the White House. And so it was different. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, he had young children. And working out of the White House became very crowded, and he had a lot of young kids. So eventually he built the West Wing. And eventually it was redesigned a bit, and William Howard Taft and then Franklin Roosevelt changed it a bit, so it created this Oval Office, became the most famous office in the world.
A couple of points on the Oval Office. One, there was a time when presidents went to the Oval pretty quick after the inauguration, and that was my dad. Brother George gets elected, and my dad said, I want to go to the Oval Office and be with you.
And your father was there.
Yeah, he was there. No, he broke whatever tradition there might have been. He wanted to see his son in the Oval Office as quickly as possible. It was pretty cool.
So I was there last time I was in the Oval Office. President Trump fired me as the chairman of the Kennedy Center. I've been the chairman of the Kennedy Center for 14 years. George Herbert Walker Bush recommended me to his son, George W. Bush, and he put me on the Kennedy Center board, and then I stayed on for 20 years, but for the last 14 as the chairman. And President Trump decided he wanted to be the chairman, so I'm the first person ever fired by a president and also succeeded by him. And he's now the chairman of the Kennedy Center. So he didn't say he was sorry, but he asked me to come and see him. I went to see him in the Oval Office, and he said, how do you like the way I've redecorated the Oval Office? Well, what am I supposed to say? There's a lot of gold in it, and I didn't want to say too much gold. I said, well, you got a lot of portraits of Republican presidents here. I said, how many do you have? He said, I got 17. 17.
Got Franklin Pierce? Oh, he was a Democrat.
And he said, I said, where'd you get them on? He said, I got them from the National Gallery of Art. And I said, well, I'm the chairman of that. You want that job also? And he said, I don't know. Should I? I don't know. So I'm still the chair of the National Gallery of Art, but I might not be tomorrow.
So one other question about the Oval Office. So you were there at the end, and an extraordinary thing happened on that inauguration day, which was at noon, the American hostages were released from Iran, or got out of airspace at like 12:01.
Right. that what happened was Carter made a fatal miscalculation. He did not want to let the Shah in. He resisted it. He thought it was terrible. He thought there could be an overtaking of the embassy, and one had occurred earlier. But there was a committee of people that were designed to convince the president to let the Shah in. It was David Rockefeller, who has been a friend of the Shah, and Henry Kissinger, another friend of the Shah, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and John McCloy and others. They lobbied hard, and Carter just was so mad at them after months of this. Finally, he just threw down something and just said, "Okay, let him in." And it turned out he was let in under a false pretense. The theory was that he had cancer. The only place he could get treatment that was adequate was Sloan Kettering. But it turned out that Sloan Kettering didn't really have any cancer treatment that was better than what he was getting in Mexico. And he already was in stage 4. It really wouldn't have made a difference if he didn't come to the United States. But the hostages were taken, and we thought, and everybody in the intelligence community thought, that the hostages would be released in 2 or 3 days, and that was the intelligence. But then Ayatollah didn't know exactly what to do. He hadn't really been in charge of taking over the hostages, and so eventually he realized it was a political benefit. He decided to keep him for a while. Okay. We thought that eventually they'd let him out, and it went on for a year. Carter made the fatal mistake of saying, "I'm not going to leave the White House until they're released." Well, that meant for a year, people were focusing, and you may remember the Ted Koppel show, X number of days, and that the hostages are still there. And we could never really figure out why we couldn't get him out, and we were doing everything. But in the end, there's some stories now, it's in the book and other books, that William Casey, later became the head of the CIA under Ronald Reagan, may have said to the hostage keepers or their intermediaries, "We'll get you a better deal." Nobody really knows. But one thing was clear: they didn't want to let Carter get the credit. So as soon as Reagan was sworn in, within 20 minutes, the hostages were released. And had Carter not made it such a big deal, maybe it would have been different. One of his problems was that he met with the hostage families all the time. And Brzezinski said, "Don't meet with the hostage families, you'll bond with them. And if you bond with them, you'll never want to do anything like, sending a military mission in." Carter was, in my view, to some extent a pacifist. And I don't think he really felt he could use military force. He never really wanted to use military force. And the hostage rescue mission was poorly conceived and obviously didn't work. But, had Carter used military force, and even if the hostage had died, Carter might have been reelected because people would have said, well, he was trying to do something for the country. But the way we did it, it ensured that Carter was going to lose the election.
Let's talk a little bit about President Carter's post-presidency, which was long,
right.
And incredibly productive in so many ways. Some good, some bad, but definitely he stayed completely engaged. And that was relatively new, I guess. I guess Hoover was active in a lot. Their post-presidency has become more of the norm, I guess, of being active, but he certainly set the stage.
Carter was president for 4 years. And 4 years, couldn't get reelected. He was former president for 44 years, 11 times as long. So he had 11 times as long to kind of do things. And Carter was a bit of a Renaissance man. He had enormous energy and intellectual interest. So he, in his 44 years, he not only built the Carter Center, but he also monitored elections around the world, more than 100 of them. He did some negotiations for presidents of the United States, went to North Korea, went to Haiti. But he also helped to eliminate guinea worm and river blindness, 2 afflictions in Africa. And he became a painter. He wrote, I think, 28 books. He wrote a book of poetry. He did woodworking. He just did in so many different things. He had a lot of intellectual interest, and he had an incredible partner, just like your father and your mother had this incredible relationship. He was married, I think, for 76 years or so.
Yeah, he broke my mom and dad's record.
Right. They were married, 60-some years?
He went way past him. I was really upset about that.
But so Carter was, it's interesting. He came to Washington as a hero. He had slayed the Watergate dragon and basically came as a fresh face. He left 4 years later in disgrace. He had lost to your father and Ronald Reagan in overwhelmingly humiliating loss. I think it was like 489 to 49 or something like that. And he went into depression. They really went into depression. They were almost bankrupt. And they rebuilt their life. And for 44 years, they did pretty well. After that, he lived to 100 years old. He accomplished a lot. And his reputation changed. When he came to Washington, he was a hero. He left 4 years later as a kind of a goat, and he came back 44 years later as a hero. And at his funeral in the National Cathedral, at the service there, people praised him for so many things he had done, but they mentioned more about what he'd done the 44 years as a former president than what he had done in his 4 years as president.
And Habitat for Humanity, without his direct involvement, he was still banging nails at the age of 90. I mean,
yes,
pretty amazing.
The Habitat for Humanity, some of you have probably heard of this. He didn't invent it. Many people thought he invented Habitat for Humanity. He didn't. It was invented in Georgia, and somebody early on came to Carter after he left the presidency and said, would you get involved? And Carter actually has some pretty good carpentry skills and so forth. So he said, yes, I'll give you a week a year. Send me anywhere, I'll build houses. And I said to Carter once, Mr. President, I'm sure the people are well-meaning, but, would you really want to live in a house built by a bunch of amateurs? And he said, David, the houses are better because they're so afraid that they don't know what they're doing that instead of nailing in one nail, they put in 10 nails. And so it's much sturdier because the amateurs are so afraid it's not going to work, they just put too many nails in. So the houses are pretty sturdy, apparently.
So let's talk about my dad's post-presidency. When did you think that it would be cool to have a Baker Bush team helping Carlo?
What happened was...
what were they doing?
After, I didn't know your father, really. I didn't know Jim Baker. What happened was I had recruited Frank Carlucci to join a very small firm, Carlyle, at the time, and he had been Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, and then he could open doors. Nobody ever heard of me, nobody ever heard of Carlyle, but Frank Carlucci, as a former Secretary of Defense, could call people and get them on the phone, and people would listen to him, and people would meet with him. So I thought, well, Carlucci was pretty good, but Jim Baker would be really good because he was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Chief of Staff, the gold standard on so many of these jobs, but I didn't know him. So I knew a Democrat that knew him. His name was Robert Strauss, a good Texan.
Yeah.
And Bob Strauss was a really funny guy. He was a special trade rep under Carter years, and I said, can you introduce me to Jim Baker? And Jim Baker was then working as the Chief of Staff as your father's administration was winding down. And so I went in to see Jim Baker in the Oval, and not the Oval, in the Chief of Staff's office. And I said, I got this little firm. I'd like to get, you in it. And I got Carlucci. And he said, what are you talking about? I mean, I'm not going to do that. So I didn't get too very far. But I kept persisting, and I tried to meet him again and so forth. And finally, I realized there was a guy that worked for President Bush and Jim Baker who was telling him, don't go do this with Carlyle. It's a little firm. It's not going anywhere. And his name was Dick Darman. And Dick Darman, I finally figured out that he was the guy saying no. Now, my secretary in the White House, the career secretary, later became Dick Darman's secretary. And so through her, I got a meeting with Dick Darman. And I went in to see Dick, and he was then the head of OMB, outgoing head of OMB. And I said, look, this is why it'd be good for Baker. He can still practice law. We'll do some things. He will make some money out of it. It'll be good. And he said, I didn't think this was a good idea, but now I actually do think it's a good idea. In fact, I think it's a good idea, but I'd like to join too. So I said, well, okay, is Baker okay with it? He said, well, you call Baker and see if he's okay if I come also. So I called Jim Baker and I said, look, Dick Darman is now going to recommend you come, but he'd like to come too. And Jim Baker said, well, would that reduce my share of the partnership? And I said, no, you'll keep your same shares. He said, it's okay. So then what happened was at one of our events, I invited George Herbert Walker Bush to come to speak, and he agreed to speak, and then he learned a little bit about our firm, and he knew Baker was associated with it, and then I said, why don't you become an advisor to us? And he did for a while, and he helped us a lot, and I traveled many places with him, and it was just, as you know, engaging person, friendly as could be, writes you thank you letters and notes all the time, and then many times your mother came as well, and I thought they were just incredible, a couple, and I really, one of the most pleasurable things in my life is getting to know them. So we spent a lot of time together, traveling in Asia and the Middle East and around the United States. It was a very good experience for me, and I enjoyed it a lot. And I remember one time when there was a hostage, somebody had the Taliban had done something, and then there was there was an American Taliban who'd gone over.
Oh yeah.
And then he is from Marin County, and Marin County is outside of San Francisco. And,
Hot tub capital of the world.
Hippie place. And your father said something like, it's a Marin County hot tubber, and that got a lot of attention. So I gave a gift to the President Bush of a hot tub up in Kennebunkport. I don't know if it's still there or not.
It is there, yeah.
So anyway, he seemed to like it. But anyway.
So tell me, I called your kids up to get some, try to get some information to make this a little more lively. And one of the things that they said was ask you about Jim Baker told you about the 5 Ps.
Yes.
Which are words to live by. Probably good for the students here to listen to this because I heard them and I agree.
Okay. Jim Baker was successful for many reasons, but one of them was he was always prepared. I noticed if I would ask some people to do something, they would say, okay, I'll do it. Jim Baker, he would ask you questions. He would always be ready for it. He would make sure he really knew what he was doing. An unusual habit in Washington, D.C., actually know what you're doing. And so, and so he told me how he came this way. He said that his father drilled into him these 5 Ps. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. His father drilled that into him, and it worked. He was a very forceful person and very dedicated, very meticulous. But as everybody here knows, Jim Baker was a lawyer in Houston, and he played tennis with your father, I guess, at the River Oaks Country Club, and they won a couple of championships. And then your father asked him to run his campaign for the Senate, I think, the first time. It's the first time he ran, or second time he ran? Second time, and Jim Baker famously said, well, I don't know anything about politics, and also I'm a Democrat. And so while we can fix the latter part, you can register again. And so Jim Baker ran the campaign, didn't win. And then what happened was your father lost the Senate campaign, but Richard Nixon, who had importuned your father to run, ultimately gave him a job of being the ambassador to the UN. And from that, he later became, in effect, our ambassador to China, and then later the head of the CIA. And I think George Herbert Walker Bush ultimately brought Jim Baker to Washington as well to work, and then they had a really close relationship of many, many years. And George Bush and Jim Baker had a really good partnership where one was the candidate, one was the person who wasn't the candidate, but they kind of belonged quite well, and they really enjoyed each other. When I saw them together, they had an incredible relationship, and you don't see many of that kind of relationships in Washington anymore.
So you have, it's interesting, as Secretary of State, I think as Secretary Baker doing his job, and I'm so excited that we're honoring him by naming the pavilion tomorrow, because in my mind, no disrespect, David, he's the greatest living American right now. And it's just going to be cool to see him.
Yes. Well,
but you're close. You're close.
No.
But what I think is really true was the bond that they had, the trust that they had when he would travel to, there was a very turbulent world, not dissimilar to how it is now. But he was Secretary of State. When he said the United States position is X, everybody knew it to be true, because there was this bond, friendship that started, and that became a bond that the whole world knew. And it's kind of important. Your word needs to be your bond, particularly if you're the leader of the greatest country on the face of the earth. And I think Jim Baker played that role extraordinarily well because of the friendship.
I agree. Look, Jim Baker was chief of staff. He was in an awkward position. He had been managing your father's campaign, and yet he's now being asked to be the chief of staff to Ronald Reagan. I mean, so that's a delicate situation. All the Reaganites didn't trust Jim Baker, and he obviously did a very good job at that and became the gold standard. But he didn't like the job. He wanted to get out of it, but he did it for 4 years. And then he later became Secretary of Treasury, swapping jobs with Don Regan. And he did a really good job there. And then later, when he managed your father's campaign, he later your father's first appointment was to announce that Jim Baker would be Secretary of State. And Jim Baker always said that a Secretary of State can only succeed if the President really supports him. And people can't get in between the President and Secretary of State, and nobody could, because they knew that their relationship was so close. And that's why when he could travel the world, he didn't have to worry about somebody at the White House undercutting him, which is often the case in Washington, D.C. And Brent Scowcroft, as National Security Advisor, would never try to do that. So it was a great partnership, and it worked very well. And obviously, the great foreign policy success was the war in Kuwait. And that was put together with your father and Jim Baker and others, and it worked so well. It was a model.
You got to know my mom, God bless her. Did she ever lecture you like she did the rest of us? Did you ever get on her bad side? I feel the looming presence of my mother. Then she's back there, I think, isn't she? She's about ready to hit me across the head.
Mother was strong-willed, I would say, but she got me involved in something that she probably didn't realize I would stay involved with it. I'm the chairman of the Library of Congress board, and I do that in part because I really believe in the importance of literacy. Your mother started an adult literacy foundation, which still exists, and I give a fair amount of money to the Library of Congress to give out the literacy awards and so forth. And literacy is very important because, as I learned from your mother, 21% of the adults in this country are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. If you can't read past the 4th grade level, you have no chance of really succeeding in our society. 80% of the people in the juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate, and 2/3 of the people in the federal prison system are functionally illiterate. And your mother really spent a lot of time on literacy. You're involved in it as well. Are you the chairman of it now, or?
No, but I was the chairman.
It's an important problem in our country, and she really helped work on that and got me involved in it as well. And your mother was in a very strong-willed, and she would tell you what she think. Like there's a story in your brother's book about his life and his presidency, and in it he talks about how one time he decided to run a half marathon, and the half marathon is, I think it's in Maine. He's running a half marathon, sweating and everything, and your mother's coming out of church as the race is going forward with your father, and she sees her son running, but he's sweating, not doing so well, and she yells out, "George, there's some fat lady ahead of you. You should do better than what you're doing. Hurry up and speed up." And he said, "Thanks,
like
Mom."
my mom.
That sounds like her, right?
Yeah, I'm old enough to be a kid as Barbara Bush's son, where there was not a child abuse hotline, for which he. Now, the stuff that she did to us, she'd probably be going to.
What was her nickname? The Enforcer, or?
The Silver Fox, the Enforcer.
But
my mom.
She's well organized. I mean, look, you've got a lot of kids and a lot of grandkids, and she had to be tough. And so I think her grandchildren were afraid of leaving their towel on the floor up in Kennebunkport or something.
Exactly. She gave you the look. Anybody got the look from her? Wow, it was scary. So my dad was an avid sportsman. He loved to fish. In Nantucket off your beautiful property. He was the first baseman at Yale. And you talk in your interview with my brother about owning the Rangers, and now you own the Orioles. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of sports in America, and what the heck are you doing owning the Orioles? There you are right there, signing autographs.
Well, the people in Baltimore are probably wondering that too, because they were in first place when I bought them, and they're in last place now. I've increased the payroll by 59%, but it hasn't done anything. So what happened was I got lucky in life. My parents were not high school graduates, and I'm their only child. I got lucky as I worked my way through the business world, and so I decided to get more involved in philanthropy and so forth. And but as I thought about it a couple years ago, I'd given away a fair amount of money in Washington and other parts of the United States, but for Baltimore I hadn't done very much, except for some support for Johns Hopkins, where I was on the board for a while. And so I decided I should do something more for Baltimore. Baltimore's had a tough time. When I was growing up, it was the 9th biggest city in the United States, population of about 930,000. Now it's a population of about 600,000. It's 62% African American. The whites have largely moved out, as have the corporate headquarters. Very high STD rates, very high illiteracy rate, very high murder rate, and it's got some real problems. And so I thought Baltimore Orioles kind of unite the city a bit, even though they haven't won a World Series since in about 40 years. But they unite the city, and there are people who really love the Orioles because we lost our hockey team, we lost our basketball team, the Colts moved away one time, and we have another football team there. It's not the same as the Colts in the view of some diehard Baltimore people. So I thought if I could re-energize the Orioles, and maybe it would help revive the city a bit. And that's why I did it. It's really, I don't want to lose money on it, but I just expect that eventually when I die, my kids will eventually figure out what to do with the stake. But it's designed to help Baltimore and give back to the city that, I was born in, my parents were born in, my parents are buried there, I'll be buried there. And so I decided I should do more than I had done for Baltimore. That's why I did it.
So baseball in my youth was the sport. It was the number one sport in America. My mom would go to the Astros games pretty recently and would do the score like the old school,
sure.
5-4 to 1 or 4 to 3, I guess it was called. I mean, that stuff now for the next generation of people to support baseball, they're interested in things that happen really quick, and their attention span is like a gnat. So how's baseball going to transform itself to regain its stature as the national pastime?
Well, it's changed a lot, and it's changed in this sense. When I was a Little League All-Star when I was 8, and I peaked at 9. But I like to remind people it was a Jewish Little League, so there were no, I thought I was going to be Sandy Koufax, but didn't quite work out. But when I went way to college, I stopped paying attention to baseball and haven't paid attention for 50 years. Now I'm back, I realized the game has changed a lot because they have new statistics. So some of you who know baseball, you ever heard what a complete game is? You know what that is? That's when a pitcher actually pitches all 9 innings. There's no such thing anymore. So they have a new statistic they invented called quality starts. You actually pitch 6 innings and only give up 3 runs. They have a new statistic called a WAR, which is games you're responsible for winning. And the statistics have changed dramatically. The players have changed. The rules have changed. We've tried to do some things in baseball to speed up the game. But we've gotten the pitching clock now, so the game is speeding up by about 25 minutes or so, and we're making some other rule changes. But baseball has suffered from this problem. The other leagues have gone up in value dramatically. The NFL now has teams that are being valued at $10 billion. A basketball team is now being valued at $10 billion. No baseball team is valued at $10 billion, even though it was called the national pastime, and we still have more people going to Major League Baseball games every year than NFL games. The value of the franchises haven't gone up. And as a result, we've got to do some things to make it more appealing to fans, and we're working on it. But, I'm only one of 30 owners, so it's, trying to be the young guy telling all the other guys who've been around for a while how to run the team and run baseball is not that easy. Some of these guys have owned the teams for 20 and 30 years. And so when I show up and say, let's do this, and I do that, they just tell me this, sit back and wait your turn.
I put together a group with Derek Jeter to buy the Marlins, and I backed out for a variety of reasons. And like 6 months after I backed out, my wife told me she's praying the rosary that I not get it. And I'm glad her prayers came true.
Well, at the price you were paying,
exactly, it would have been a disaster. 1.2 billion is probably worth 800 million now. Anyway,
well, I hope it's worth more than that. I hope there's no team that's only worth 800 million, because I paid 1.7 billion. So who knows?
I went on the Wikipedia page for you, and it's incredible. I mean, you're the most energetic 75-year-old man? 76-year-old man that exists on the planet. Let me just go through this. Co-founder of the Carlyle Group, principal owner of the Orioles, author of 4 books, chairman of the National Gallery of Art still, maybe at the end of the day that might not happen, chairman of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Economic Club of Washington, D.C. You've been the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Duke University. You're a member of the board of Harvard Corporation, which must be a doozy right now. Trustee at Johns Hopkins Medicine, director of the Lincoln Center, trustee of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, chairman of the National Gallery of Art, former chairman of the Smithsonian Institute, and you mentioned the Kennedy Center. You're recognized as the best interviewer in America today. You have 4 television shows on PBS and Bloomberg. You're a phenomenal father and a great grandfather. My question is, why do you make the rest of us look like slackers? I mean,
not that.
It's incredible.
I have always felt I got lucky in life, and I wanted to give back in some extent. And I've done a TV series now on longevity, and it's on Bloomberg. And if all of you want to live longer, and my theory is, when you turn 55, you realize you've lived longer than you're probably going to live. So people want to live longer, so they're starting to do things to live longer. And I now know that you can live longer if you exercise more, eat well, don't drink excessively, don't smoke, get enough sleep, and some other things. And if you have good genes, that can help as well. And I just want to give back and feel like I've done something useful with my life. I tell people all the time, we're only on the planet for a short period of time. Relatively speaking, the grand span of life, we're on the planet for 80 years, 90 years, maybe 100 years or so. You want to look back and say, what have I done with my 80, 90, 100 years, if you're fortunate to live not long, that justifies my parents having created me? And what do you want your parents to think of you? If your parents are still alive, what do you want your parents to think what you've done that's useful? And what do you want your children to think that you've done with what's useful with your life? And now your children are never going to tell you that you've done something useful with your life, probably. Your parents might. And I was fortunate my parents lived long enough to see some of the things I was able to do. But I just feel I want to do something to give back to the country, give back to my society, and that's kind of what motivates me. And I just feel that I'm not as good at certain things as I'd like to do, so I have to keep doing more things because it'll make up for the fact that the things I do I'm not as good at. So I do more things. People won't notice I'm not good at one thing or another thing. So, but I enjoy everything I'm doing, and but I would just say, let me ask you a question. So
No. I'm not finished yet.
Oh, you're not finished yet?
No. So, by the way, your children are incredibly proud of you. I talked to them.
They never told me that. They've never told me that. What? They only say, Dad, can you send more money?
They love you. They love you very much, and they're very proud of you. And they told me one thing I thought was interesting, which was, for most of your life, you didn't exercise. And you started exercising. Why did you start working out?
Well,
hang on one second. I want to show you something.
Oh, yes, that's my muscles. I was never a great athlete. A lot of my friends who were great athletes, they were all American athletes, and I just didn't have that skill set. When I tried out for the junior varsity baseball team in high school, after I thought I did pretty well, the coach came back and said, I really want you to be on this team, and I think you should be the manager. And I thought, geez, I'm going to get to be the manager of the team? I didn't realize the manager is the equipment person. So I said, I don't want to do that. So I guess when you reach a certain age, you realize that you've got to stay in shape, because if you don't stay in shape, you're probably going to live less long than you would like to live. And so I'm trying to exercise more, but it's harder because when you're traveling a lot and it's hard to get time for it. I try to eat better than I used to, but I'm not a perfect person. I wish I would exercise more. And you can't exercise. If you exercise an hour a day, that's great. And I know you're exercising. I'm just not as religious about it. I have built gyms in my homes, and I have the theory that if I walk past the gym, maybe by osmosis it'll work. But it hasn't. Doctors don't tell me that usually works so well.
So you've taken a real interest in longevity, as have a lot of people. I can see in the crowd that there's a real interest in longevity for most of us. And you're doing these interviews. Who are the top people that have really excited you about the prospect of living healthier longer?
I interviewed a doctor today who's from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, New York, and he told me he's an expert on longevity. And basically, if you have a certain genes, you're going to live longer than the average person. And you can determine whether you have those genes or not. And some people have them, some people don't. If you don't have those genes, you've got to really work at it. Assuming no accident or so forth, you've got to sleep 6 to 7 hours, 8 hours a night is really, really essential. Eating well, intermittent fasting can be a way to help with your diet. GLP-1 drugs can be a very good way to kind of lose some weight. Obesity is a gigantic problem in this country. It turns out that it's just hard to believe, but a third of the people in this country are obese, and more than 50% are overweight, including me. I can't lose as much weight as I want to lose, and it's tough. So I asked Henry Kissinger once, I interviewed him and said, Henry, you're 97 years old. You're massively overweight. You eat Wiener Schnitzel for breakfast every day of your life. You've never exercised one day in your life. You can't hear, you can't see, you can't walk. How come you made it to 97? He said, my parents made it to the late 90s. I don't have to worry about it because I have good genes. He was probably right. He made it to 100. If you don't have good genes, there's other things you should do, and I got to do more of those things. But
so tell me about patriotic philanthropy. You've done some incredible things. What's next on the agenda that you can share? Thank you for doing it, by the way.
What I meant by this is this. Well, I stumbled into this. If I'd asked McKinsey, what can I do to give back to the country, they would come and give some paper and something. But one day, like most things in life, happened by serendipity. What happened was I went to view a copy of the Magna Carta. It was in New York. I didn't really have a particular interest in the Magna Carta, but I went there, and the curator said it's going to be sold tomorrow. It's being auctioned off. It's the only copy in private hands. It's owned by Ross Perot, who's selling it off, and it's the only one in private hands, the only one in the United States, and we think it's going to go to somebody from Russia or some other countries that they mentioned. So I said I will go buy it, and I went the next night, and I didn't want to tell people I'm going to buy it. It sounds presumptuous to say you're going to buy the Magna Carta, and I want to tell my kids, they say, how much less money might this mean for us? I don't know. So I ultimately, I did win it, and I gave it to the National Archives, and I said it's a down payment of my gift to give back to the country, because it's a document that was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence. I then started buying other copies of Declarations of Independence and other rare documents, Emancipation Proclamation, putting them in places where people can see them and lend them out. And then I decided that when the Washington Monument had its earthquake damage, I would fix it. I was surprised people thought it was surprising for a private citizen to fix the Washington Monument. The Congress didn't want to move quickly enough. And then I started fixing other buildings, Mount Vernon, the Custis Lee Mansion, Monticello, Montpelier, Iwo Jima Memorial, other things. And I kind of called it all patriotic philanthropy. What I meant was giving money to help and time to remind people the history and heritage of our country. We don't really know history and heritage of our country as well as we should because we don't teach civics very much anymore. People go to college today, they only want to major in STEM subjects. They're afraid they can't get a job if they don't get a STEM major. And so we have, used to be when I was in college, 8% of the people who were undergraduates were history majors. Now it's about 1%. And so you see, this is an amazing statistic I'm going to tell you about now. Is there anybody here that's a naturalized American citizen? Anybody? All right, a naturalized American citizen. You have to take a citizenship test, 5 years of residence. You take a citizenship test. 91% of the people who are not born here take this test. And we have about 50 million immigrants in the country. Probably 40 million have become citizens. 91% of the people who have come to this country take a test about how many branches are there in the federal government, who's the first president. The same test was given to people who were born in this country. A couple years ago, the same test was given, and to about 3.5 million people, and in only one state, Vermont, could a bare majority in Vermont pass the test. In every other state, a majority of the citizens couldn't pass the basic citizenship test, which shows you that people don't know much about our history. Why should you know much about history? The theory of history is if you don't know about the history in the past, you're likely to repeat the same mistakes. The theory of history is learn from the past and improve on it, and that's why I'm trying to remind people of history and heritage. So when you preserve documents and preserve buildings, it does it, and this is the final point. If the brain has evolved enormously over the years, but it hasn't evolved to this extent yet. If you see a picture of the Washington Monument on a computer slide, you can push a button and you go to the next slide. But if you actually visit the Washington Monument, because it's an attractive place, it's not crumbling, you'll learn more about it because before you go there, you'll read about it. When you're there, you get a tour about it, and you get a curator tell you about it, and afterwards, you'll probably read about it. So the theory about preserving these things is that people are more likely to go visit them and see them in person and then learn more about our history and heritage, and therefore maybe be better citizens. That's the whole theory.
It's a fantastic theory. And David, it's a phenomenal theory that's lived each and every day here at Texas A&M University. It's one of the universities that people, the students and the whole community loves this country with their heart and soul. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate your interviewing me, and I thought everybody had to stand up for the interview. I didn't know whether you're allowed to sit down at Texas A&M, right? I thought everybody had to stand up, but I appreciate your letting me sit down. I thought I had to do the standing up, but thank you for doing this, and thank you for all the research you've done. And I wish the presidential election a couple years ago had gone differently, and you were president of the United States, and you're finishing your second term, or you had finished your second term. You were a great citizen of Florida and our country, and the country would have been a lot better off if you become president.
Thank you, David.
Thanks a lot.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That was extraordinary, and we're so proud to have had such a dear friend of President Bush with us tonight, and of course his son. If you've not had the opportunity to purchase The Highest Calling, it's out in the lobby, and David Rubenstein will make himself available for signing. We hope you enjoyed the program tonight, and we hope you'll continue to enjoy the programming that we provide at the George and Barbara Bush Foundation here at Texas A&M University. Thank you all for being with us, and have a wonderful evening.